Section 25 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 30. Francis I and the Reformation, Part 5. Search has been made to discover whether the assertion of the bourgeois de Paris has any foundation, whether Pope Paul III really did write in June 1535 the letter attributed to him, and whether its effect was that the king wrote to Parliament not to proceed against the Reformers "with such rigor." No proof has, however, been obtained as to the authenticity of the pope's letter, and in any case it was not very effectual, for the same bourgeois de Paris reports that in September 1535, 3 months after that, according to him, it was written, "Two fellows, makers of silk ribbons and tissues, were burned all alive, one in the Place Maubert and the other in St. John's Cemetery, as Lutherans, which they were. They had handed over to their host at Paris some Lutheran books to take care of, saying, 'Keep this book for us while we go into the city and show it to nobody.' When they were gone, this host was not able to refrain from showing this book to a certain priest, the which, after having looked at it, said incontinently, 'This is a very wicked book, and proscribed.' Then the said host went to the commissioner of police to reveal that he had such and such a book of such an one, the which sent forthwith to the house of the said host to take off and carry the said two fellows to the Chatelet. Being questioned, they confessed the state of the case. Whereupon, by sentence of the said commissioner, confirmed by decree, 'they made honorable amends in front of the church of Notre Dame de Paris, had their tongues cut out, and were burned all alive and with unshaken obstinacy.'" Proceedings and executions, then, did not cease, even in the case of the most humble class of Reformers, and at the very moment when Francis I was exerting himself to win over the Protestants of Germany with the cry of conciliation and re establishment of harmony in the church. Melancthon, Bucer, and Luther himself had allowed themselves to be tempted by the prospect. But the German politicians, princes, and councillors were more clear sighted. "We at Augsburg," wrote Seiler, deputy from that city, "know the King of France well; he cares very little for religion, or even for morality. He plays the hypocrite with the pope, and gives the Germans the smooth side of his tongue, thinking of nothing but how to cheat them of the hopes he gives them. His only aim is to crush the emperor." The attempt of Francis I thus failed, first in Germany, and then at Paris also, where the Sorbonne was not disposed, any more than the German politicians were, to listen to any talk about a specious conciliation; and the persecution resumed its course in France, paving the way for civil war. The last and most atrocious act of persecution in the reign of Francis I was directed not against isolated individuals, but against a whole population, harried, despoiled, and banished or exterminated on account of heresy. About the year 1525, small churches of Reformers began to assume organization between the Alps and the Jura. Something was there said about Christians who belonged to the Reformation without ever having been reformed. It was said that in certain valleys of the Piedmontese Alps and Dauphiny and in certain quarters of Provence there were to be found believers who for several centuries had recognized no authority save that of the Holy Scriptures. Some called them Vaudians or Valdensians, others poor of Lyons, others Lutherans. The rumor of the Reformation was heard in their valleys, and created a lively emotion amongst them. One of them determined to go and see what this Reformation was, and he returned to his valleys with good news and with pious books. Regular relations were from that time established between the Reformers of Switzerland, France, and Germany, and the Christian shepherds of these mountains. Visits were exchanged. Farel and Saunier went amongst the Vaudians and conversed with them about their common faith, common in spite of certain differences. Rustic conferences, composed of the principal landholders, barbas or pastors, and simple members of the faithful, met more than once in the open air under the pines of their mountains. The Vaudians of Provence had been settled there since the end of the 13th century, and in the course of the 14th other Vaudians from Dauphiny and even from Calabria had come thither to join them. "Their barbas," says a contemporary monk, "used to preside at their exercises of religion, which were performed in secret. As they were observed to be quiet and circumspect, as they faithfully paid taxes, tithe, and seigneurial dues, and as they were besides very laborious, they were not troubled on the score of their habits and doctrines." Their new friends from Switzerland and Germany reproached them with concealment of their faith and worship. As soon as they had overtly separated from the Roman Church, persecution began. Francis I. checked its first excesses, but it soon began again. The episcopal prisons were filled with Vaudians, who bristled at the summons to abjure; and on the 29th of March, 1535, 13 of them were sentenced to be burned alive. Pope Paul III. complained to Francis I. of their obstinacy. The king wrote about it to the Parliament of Aix. The Parliament ordered the lords of the lands occupied by the Vaudians to force their vassals to abjure or leave the country. When cited to appear before the court of Aix to explain the grounds of their refusal, several declined. The court sentenced them, in default, to be burned alive. Their friends took up arms and went to deliver the prisoners. Merindol was understood to be the principal retreat of the sectaries. By decree of November 18, 1540, the Parliament ordered that "the houses should be demolished and razed to the ground, the cellars filled up, the woods cut down, the trees of the gardens torn up, and that the lands of those who had lived in Merindol should not be able to be farmed out to anybody, whatever of their family or name." In the region of Parliament itself, complaints were raised against such hardships. The premier president, Barthélemy Chassaneuz, was touched, and adjourned the execution of the decree. The king commissioned William du Bellay to examine into the facts. The report of Du Bellay was favorable to the Vaudians, as honest, laborious, and charitable farmers, discharging all the duties of civil life; but at the same time he acknowledged that they did not conform to the laws of the church, that they did not recognize the pope or the bishops, that they prayed in the vulgar tongue, and that they were in the habit of choosing certain persons from amongst themselves to be their pastors. On this report, Francis I., by a declaration of February 18, 1541, pardoned the Vaudians for all that had been irregular in their conduct, on condition that, within the space of 3 months, they should abjure their errors; and he ordered the Parliament to send to Aix deputies from their towns, burghs, and villages to make abjuration in the name of all, at the same time authorizing the Parliament to punish, according to the ordinances, those who should refuse to obey, and to make use, if need were, of the services of the soldiery. Thus persecuted and condemned for their mere faith, undemonstrative as it was, the Vaudians confined themselves to asking that it might be examined and its errors pointed out. Those of Merindol and those of Cabrières in the countship of Venasque drew up their profession of faith and sent it to the king and to 2 bishops of the province, Cardinal Sadolet, Bishop of Carpentras, and John Dorandy, Bishop of Cavaillon, whose equity and moderation inspired them with some confidence. Cardinal Sadolet did not belie their expectation; he received them with kindness, discussed with them their profession of faith, pointed out to them diverse articles which might be remodelled without disavowing the basis of their creed, and assured them that it would always be against his sentiments to have them treated as enemies. "I am astonished," he wrote to the pope, "that these folks should be persecuted when the Jews are spared." The Bishop of Cavaillon testified towards them a favor less unalloyed. "I was quite sure," said he, "that there was not so much mischief amongst you as was supposed. However, to calm men's minds, it is necessary that you should submit to a certain appearance of abjuration." "But what would you have us abjure if we are already within the truth?" "It is but a simple formality that I demand of you. I do not require, in your case, notary or signature. If you are unwilling to assent to this abjuration, none can argue you into it." "We are plain men, Monseigneur; we are unwilling to do anything to which we cannot assent." And they persisted in their refusal to abjure. Cardinal Sadolet was summoned to Rome, and the premier president Chassaneuz died suddenly. His successor, John de Maynier, Baron of Oppede, was a violent man, passionately bigoted, and, moreover, it is said, a personal enemy of the Vaudians of Cabrières, on which his estates bordered. He recommenced against them a persecution which was at first covert; they had found protectors in Switzerland and in Germany. At the instance of Calvin, The Swiss Protestant cantons and the German princes assembled at Schmalkalden wrote to Francis I. in their favor. It was to his interest to humor the Protestants of Germany, and that fact turned out to the advantage of the Vaudians of Provence; and on the 14th of June, 1544, he issued an edict which, suspending the proceedings commenced against them, restored to them their privileges, and ordered such of them as were prisoners to be set at large. "And as the attorney general of Provence," it goes on to say, "is related to the Archbishop of Aix, their sworn enemy, there will be sent in his place a councillor of the court for to inform me of their innocence." But some months later the peace of Crespy was made, and Francis I. felt no longer the same solicitude about humoring the Protestants of Switzerland and Germany. Baron d'Oppede zealously resumed his work against the Vaudians. He accused them of intriguing with foreign Reformers, and of designing to raise 15,000 men to surprise Marseilles and form Provence into a republic. On the 1st of January, 1545, Francis I. signed, without reading it, they say, the revocation of his edict of 1544, and ordered execution of the decree issued by the Parliament of Aix, dated November 18, 1540, on the subject of the Vaudians, "notwithstanding all letters of grace posterior to that epoch, and ordered the governor of the province to give, for that purpose, the assistance of the strong hand to justice." The duty of assisting justice was assigned to Baron d'Oppede; and from the 7th to the 25th of April, 1545, 2 columns of troops, under the orders respectively of Oppede himself and Baron de la Garde, ravaged with fire and sword the 3 districts of Merindol, Cabrieres, and Lacoste, which were peopled chiefly by Vaudians. We shrink from describing in detail all the horrors committed against a population without any means of self defence by troops giving free rein to their brutal passions and gratifying the hateful passions of their leaders. In the end, 3 small towns and 22 villages were completely sacked, 763 houses, 89 cattle sheds, and 31 barns burned, 3,000 persons massacred, 255 executed subsequently to the massacre, after a mockery of trial, 600 or 700 sent to the galleys, many children sold for slaves, and the victors, on retiring, left behind them a double ordinance from the Parliament of Aix and the vice legate of Avignon, dated the 24th of April, 1545, forbidding "that any one, on pain of death, should dare to give asylum, aid, or succor, or furnish money or victuals to any Vaudian or heretic." It is said that Francis I., when near his end, repented of this odious extermination of a small population, which, with his usual fickleness and carelessness, he had at one time protected, and at another abandoned to its enemies. Amongst his last words to his son Henry II. Was an exhortation to cause an inquiry to be made into the iniquities committed by the Parliament of Aix in this instance. It will be seen, at the opening of Henry II.'s reign, what was the result of this exhortation of his father's. Calvin was lately mentioned as having pleaded the cause of the Vaudians, in 1544, amongst the Protestants of Switzerland and Germany. It was from Geneva, where he had lived and been the dominant spirit for many years, that the French Reformer had exercised such influence over the chiefs of the German Reformation in favor of that small population whose creed and morals had anticipated by several centuries the Reformation in the 16th century. He was born in 1509 at Noyon in Picardy, was brought up in the bosom of the Catholic Church, and held a cure in 1527 at Pont l'Eveque, where he preached several times, "joyous and almost proud," as he said himself, "that a single dissertation had brought me a cure." In 1534, study, meditation on the Gospels, discussion of the religious and moral questions raised on every side, and the free atmosphere of the new spirit that was abroad, changed his convictions and his resolves. He abandoned the career of the law as well as that of the established church, resigned his cure at Pont l'Eveque, and devoted himself entirely to the work of the nascent and much opposed Reformation. Having a mind that was judicious and free from illusion in the very heat of passion, he soon saw to what an extent the success of the Reformation in France was difficult and problematical. In 1535, impressed by the obstacles it met with even more than by the dangers it evoked, he resolved to leave his country and go else whither in search of security, liberty, and the possibility of defending a cause which became the dearer to him in proportion as it was the more persecuted. He had too much sagacity not to perceive that he was rapidly exhausting his various places of asylum. Queen Marguerite of Navarre was unwilling to try too far the temper of the king her brother. Canon Louis du Tillet was a little fearful lest his splendid library should be somewhat endangered through the use made of it by his guest, who went about arguing or preaching in the vicinity of Angouleme. The queen's almoner, Gerard Roussel, considered that Calvin was going too far, and grew apprehensive lest, if the Reformation should completely succeed, it might suppress the bishopric of Oleron which he desired, and which, indeed, he at a later period obtained. Lefebvre of Etaples, who was the most of all in sympathy with Calvin, was 79 years old, and had made up his mind to pass his last days in peace. Calvin quitted Angouleme and Nerac, and went to pass some time at Poitiers, where the friends of the Reformation, assembling round him and hanging upon his words, for the first time celebrated the Lord's Supper in a grotto close to the town, which still goes by the name of Calvin's Grotto. Being soon obliged to leave Poitiers, Calvin went to Orleans, then secretly to Paris, then to Noyon to see his family once more, and set out at last for Strasbourg, already one of the strongholds of the Reformation, where he had friends, amongst others the learned Bucer, with whom he had kept up a constant correspondence. He arrived there at the beginning of the year 1535. But it was not at Strasbourg that he took up his quarters. He preferred Bâle, where also there was a reunion of men of letters, scholars, and celebrated printers, Erasmus, Simon Grinet (Grimius), and the Frobenz, and where Calvin calculated upon finding the leisure and aid he required for executing the great work he had been for some time contemplating, his Institution de la Religion Chrétienne, or Christian Institutes. This would not be the place, and we have no intention, to sum up the religious doctrines of that book. We might challenge many of them as contrary to the true meaning and moral tendency of Christianity, but we desire to set in a clear light their distinctive and original characteristics, which are those of Calvin himself in the midst of his age. These characteristics are revealed in the preface and even in the dedication of the book. It is to Francis I., the persecutor of the French Reformers, during one of the most cruel stages of the persecution, and at the very moment when he had just left his own country in order that he may live in security and speak with freedom, that Calvin dedicates his work. "Do not imagine," he says to the king, "that I am attempting here my own special defence in order to obtain permission to return to the country of my birth, from which, although I fear for it such human affection as is my bounden duty, yet, as things are now, I do not suffer any great anguish at being cut off. But I am taking up the cause of all the faithful, and even that of Christ, which is in these days so mangled and downtrodden in your kingdom that it seems to be in a desperate plight. And this has no doubt come to pass rather through the tyranny of certain Pharisees than of your own free will." Calvin was at the same time the boldest and the least revolutionary amongst the innovators of the 16th century; bold as a Christian thinker, but full of deference and consideration towards authority, even when he was flagrantly withdrawing himself from it. The idea of his book was at first exclusively religious, and intended for the bulk of the French Reformers. But at the moment when Calvin is about to publish it, prudence and policy recur to his mind, and it is to the King of France that he addresses himself. It is the authority of the royal persecutor that he invokes; it is the reason of Francis I. that he attempts to convince. He acts like a respectful and faithful subject, as well as an independent and innovating Christian. Section 25.